Okay, good evening. How's everybody doing?
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Good, 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 good. Okay, so let's go ahead and get ourselves started. Okay, we're going to start off with chapter 1. So we're going to be just kind of covering and kind of moving through some basic principles and get the kind of lay some of the groundwork for what we'll build on in the in later chapters. So first of all, we're going to just kind of do a little bit of a review of systems, get some terminology sort of things down, and kind of move on from there. Starting first of all with chapter 4, the tissues. So it's kind of an outline. Essentially, obviously, the outline that we have here is going to be the human body. Of course, in AMP1, we are going to be covering the nervous system. AMP2, you typically cover the endocrine system. Of course, you have the respiratory system. Probably one of the most important systems in the body is the cardiovascular system. There's a good reason why I say that. Spending a lot of time in our semester working on skeletal and muscular system and so forth. And so that's going to kind of round out the majority of at least what we're going to be doing in this half of AMP. Now, when we take a look at anatomy and physiology, the first thing we want to do is kind of break it down a little bit in terms of what we're talking about sort of functionally and definitionally. So anatomy is essentially when you're studying structure. So that's kind of like the study of the body's structure, size, shape, organization, things of that nature. One of the things you need to understand is that in anatomy and in your body, every little structure, even things that we think are insignificant, that don't really matter, they're too tiny to matter, everything has a name. And so like if you were to get into med school, you would end up taking gross anatomy lab, and you basically learn everything, all those little names for all those little structures that you didn't even know existed. Now, generally speaking, when we look at anatomy, oftentimes we're looking at structure, but because there's just so much, and anatomy in the human body is integrated, we oftentimes have to sort of dissect it out, if you will, kind of compartmentalize it so that we can actually wrap our heads around it. Problem with that is a lot of times we'll study structures, but we won't really get a good idea of exactly why it's there, right? A good example of that is like the holes in your skull. They just kind of look like little holes in your skull. We'll see that in the next week and the weeks after as we study the skeletal system in lab. But it's what's not understood is why those holes are there. And so if you were to put the entire anatomy together, you'd realize that those holes are basically passageways for nerves and blood vessels and things like that. And so we study structure for the sake of trying to understand function. Now, on the physiology side of things, typically what you're looking at is kind of the functional processes of the human body. And so oftentimes you're looking at regulation and things of that nature. The kind of the cellular response that the body has to various stimuli. And so those are the kind of two halves. And so, like I mentioned before, you have kind of the anatomy half of the discipline, you have the physiology half of the discipline. You really have to kind of put both together to get a good, sort of well-rounded view of how the human body is working. Now, in terms of anatomy, I mentioned gross before. There's several different types of anatomy that you could study. For instance, you have gross anatomy, which is essentially you're just basically working oftentimes with cadavers and things like that. So this is just taking a look at the overall anatomy of the body as it presents itself to the naked eye without aid of microscope or anything like that. You can break that down, gross that is. So if you take a look at gross as sort of an umbrella sort of a type of anatomy. You can break that down into specific pieces. For instance, regional is basically studying by area. For instance, a podiatrist would be focused on foot, the region of the foot. Systemic is basically if you choose to focus in on a system. So like, for instance, systemic anatomy, if you are looking at, say, the respiratory system, you may be focusing in on the structure of the lungs, for instance. And then surface anatomy, which some of you may have heard of, is basically just kind of like the external stuff. So essentially, that's kind of like you're kind of moving from sort of surface area that's kind of the most visible, like the most shallow layer, to the deeper layers of anatomy. And so you kind of move from one layer to the next. One of the things to remember is we're multi-layered, right? So when we think of anatomy, there's sort of the most uppermost layer, which typically we call either the surface layer. And then as you sort of move through it, you have kind of deeper and deeper and deeper layers. And so it's kind of like an onion. You can just kind of keep peeling layers off of us, and you have a new set of anatomy associated with different layers of the body. So we are very three-dimensional. And so some of those deeper structures are oftentimes an extension of that sort of surface type of anatomy. Now, what happens if we have something that we can't see with our eye? Like, what happens if we need a microscope? Basically something that is microscopic. Well, that's another type of anatomy. You guys just did that, right? So in lab, there's two different versions of that if you're going to be using that. So we have basically either what's called cytology, which is essentially looking at the anatomy of the cell, so an individual cell, like its organelles and things of that nature. That's kind of what cytology is. And then histology is looking at tissues. And that's kind of what you guys were doing. So we were dissecting, we were trying to figure out the different tissue types associated with our 4 overall arching different tissue types. And so cytology is essentially the study of the cell and the mechanics and the structure of the cell structure, you can think of it as, at a very cellular level. And of course, histology is at the tissue level. Now, we talked a little bit about the microscope as an aid. And just to let you guys know, if you guys have any questions at all, you feel free to chime in, to unmic and chime in, or I've got my chat screen up on my other device so I can see if you guys rifle a chat question in there as well. Okay, some other ways to basically view anatomy. You probably encountered some of these. So first of all, we have X-rays, it's a good technique. It's electromagnetic radiation. And so essentially what we do is we blast this electromagnetic radiation through your body. And what happens is that radiation interacts with the different tissues and the pieces of your body differently based on their density. And so it basically will kind of change the optical quality of that as it sort of goes through the more dense bone, for instance, and the less dense soft tissues. And then you'll capture the light on a plate, a photographic plate, and then you'll see the image, right? So for instance, if you can get optical variation between the densities of the body tissues, then you can highlight and you can see the different types of body structures. And that's kind of what an X-ray is. So this is kind of what your X-ray looks like. So you can see how the X-ray radiation is interacting with the bone. So you can see the bone very well. Not so much with the soft tissues. So you can see right around here in the nasal area, not so much there because the nasal area is cartilage, which is softer than bone. So it interacts with the radiation a little bit differently. And so it does not create as much of a contrast in image as that radiation is coming out onto the photographic plate. Then we have ultrasound. And so ultrasound basically is simply using sound waves. So you pass sound waves into the body, and that's kind of like sonar, right? So basically they will bounce off of hard objects, and then they'll come back, just like in sonar. And the idea is you can determine how close an object is based on how quickly it bounces back at you. And so the faster it bounces back at you, the closer the object is. The longer it bounces back at you, the further away it is. And so by doing that, what we can do is we can create a three-dimensional view of whatever the object is. And so different ultrasounds can have different levels of resolution on them. But typically speaking, really good ultrasounds will be able to use them to visualize like this little guy right here. And so that's a really good one. Ultrasound's being used a lot because it's non-invasive and it's highly informative, right? So basically, there's a lot of branches of medicine now that are using ultrasound technology as a diagnostic tool to be able to visualize things. I know in cardiology, there's multiple types of ultrasound techniques that are used for different types of analyses. CT, computed tomography, this is another one. So in CT, basically what's going to happen is you have X-ray images, so you do have radiation involved, but it's going to be analyzed by a computer. And so when you take a look at a CT scan, this is essentially where you're getting kind of a high resolution radiation that's then able to be analyzed by a computer. Now, analyzing by a computer is able to basically differentiate very small nuances between different types of radiation levels, whereas in X-rays, since you're just developing photographic plates, it's a little more crude, and so the resolution isn't so great. But in CTs, because a computer is the one that's analyzing it, it can really differentiate between very, very small differences in the X-ray radiation, and as a result, it can create a very nice, clear-cut picture. So here's a good CT scan, and you got a couple of different versions of it. So you can either take a CT scan, like for instance here, where you take a slice through the body. So here you can see the eyes, the orbits of the eyes. That is basically the nasal cartilage right there. So we're essentially looking from the top down. And so this is the individual's brain we're looking at. So you can see that the radiation is interacting with the different areas of the nervous system. So there's like your open cavity right there. And then of course you have the actual brain tissue right there. And so you can kind of sort of move through by layer, and you can kind of scan different layers of the brain. And then you can also, the computer basically analyze it and sort of create, for instance, a very clear, nice, high resolution picture, in this case, of the skull and the vertebrae of the individual. So CT is sort of like an X-ray that's like, you know, super high tech and super high resolution. Okay, next one is DSA. So DSA is digital subtraction angiography. It's kind of like a CT. In this case, what happens is you use a radioactive or radiopaque dye. And what it does, this helps to enhance differences. So you kind of use a contrast essentially in this particular case, and then your digital equipment will actually capture the image of the contrast itself. Like for instance, in this particular case, you inject the dye in this case in the blood, and then you can see the radioactive dye sort of showing up in all these small little tiny blood vessels and things like that. And so you can see the integrity of the blood vessels and whether or not any of them have ruptured and things of that nature. And so that's a really helpful one, especially in cardiology in general. Then we get MRI. Many of you probably have had MRIs, right? Anybody have an MRI before? Got a lot of MRI machines, yeah. Right? It's kind of like you stick yourself into a little tube. For those of you who are claustrophobic, it's not an easy process. Now, if you're anything like me, I actually fell asleep in my MRI. It was just relaxing, I guess. So I guess I'm not claustrophobic. But anyway, MRI is a little bit different because in this case, instead of using radiation, you're using a magnetic field, and the magnetic field will kind of have a similar sort of an effect in the sense that you'll kind of start to get these radio waves, which is, by the way, another type of electromagnetic energy. It's a lower energy source than X-rays. And so that's the reason why MRIs are a little bit more, how should we say, patient friendly, like people who are worried about X-ray exposure, things of that nature. MRIs tend to be a little bit more, a little less dangerous, I guess, if you want to put it that way, because radio waves are a little lower in energy. But basically what happens is you essentially do the same thing. You send these radio waves to the patient, very similar to the way that you send the X-rays through the patient. And in this case, it's collected and analyzed by a computer. So if you're using a different source of radiation in this particular case. And so as a result, you can get actually really nice images. So here's a good example of an MRI, again, of a patient's head. You can see it's very photographic. You can really see these cerebral sinuses here. You can see the gyri and the sulci of the cerebral cortex. You can actually see the corpus callosum here. You can see the thalamic adhesion right in here. And so you can see a lot of detail. There's your pons right there, your medulla oblongata and the midbrain. So nice little cerebellum right there. So you can see a lot of detail with MRI. But generally speaking, MRI, even though we could use CT as well, oftentimes MRI is used for soft tissue. So it looks really good for soft tissue. So for those of you who may have blown a tendon or something of that nature, oftentimes you have an MRI because you can see more detail with the soft tissue, a little bit more so than with CT. If you're into photography, a lot of times you can think of there's a specific photographic technique where you use kind of a lower level light, but you leave your aperture open longer. And so having that lower level light exposing the film for a longer period of time creates a richer resolution, as long as you don't move the camera. And so it's a similar sort of a thing with an MRI. Lower energy radiation is kind of allowing for a little bit better resolution. So MRIs are clearly one of the favorite techniques in medicine right now, along with ultrasound. I'd say between the two of those, you're probably talking about a good chunk of the diagnostic testing in a lot of medical fields. And then the last one is positron emission tomography, PET, right? So in this case, you take a radioactively labeled molecule that we normally utilize and you essentially follow it. For instance, in this case, we use glucose. So if we have a radioactively labeled glucose molecule, we can basically ingest the glucose and then we can follow that glucose in our body to see how it's being used by tissues. So it's really, really helpful to kind of track a molecule. This is kind of what it looks like. So when you take a look at this, you can see molecules being tracked as it's being processed in the brain. So you can see these little hot spots where this molecule tends to congregate. And so you can learn a lot of information associated with that. So you can see a lot of metabolic level activity, for instance, in tissues, in this case, the brain itself. So diagnostic testing, there's a lot of it, and it yields a lot of information for doctors to be able to figure out what's going on. Unfortunately, it's very expensive. Anybody who's had an MRI or a CT knows it's not cheap, but it is the best way to figure out what's going on. So that's anatomy. Now let's go ahead and take a look at physiology, right? So in physiology, what we're looking for is processes, right? We're looking at processes and mechanisms inside the cells and the tissues. And we're trying to figure out how these things are responding. And that's the big thing. Responding to stimulus, both external and also internal. And the goal is to basically stabilize. You want to create a stable internal condition, even though everything changes all the time. because unless you maintain a stable internal condition, you're not going to really be able to do physiologically any kind of work, because you're not going to have any kind of a standard expectation so that you know how to conduct your business, right? That's a process called homeostasis. It's basically the maintenance of internal conditions so that you can do cellular and physiological work. Now then, there's a couple of levels of physiology. You have cell physiology. Obviously, you're focusing in on the activities and the processes associated with the cells themselves. Or you have systemic physiology, in which case you're looking at organ systems. So for instance, neurophysiology will look at the nervous system and the functions of the nervous system. Cardiovascular physiology looks at the functions and the reactions and the stimulus responses associated with heart, blood vessels, and so forth. And so probably I would argue most of what you see, especially in AMP2, is probably systemic physiology. So basically you're looking at systemic physiology from one system to the next, to the next, to the next. You just kind of roll from one system to another. Now in this half, in AMP1, we will get to systemic physiology, especially when we get to muscle physiology and neurophysiology. And so we'll get to that. Now there are some disciplines that kind of have a combination of both. So anatomy and physiology kind of together, interwoven. One of those is pathology. So pathology is basically where you're looking at the structural functional consequences of particular tissues, especially disease tissues. So they essentially will look for abnormalities in tissues. So a pathologist is somebody who like really gets good at histology, number one. And then so they know, they've seen a lot, right? They've seen all sorts of variations of histology. They've seen what it can look like. They've seen all the nuances and the twists and turns of how different tissues can look like under the microscope, so that when they get a sample from the doctor and they want to know whether or not it's cancer, the pathologist can take a look at that and they can immediately diagnose whether or not this sample is cancerous or not by looking at the structure, especially the structure of the tissues and of the cells themselves. So for instance, if you get a biopsy and the doctors are trying to figure out if it's cancerous, it's oftentimes sent off to a pathologist so that they can study it and take a look at it and diagnose whether or not this is a tissue sample that is showing some sort of a disease state. In this case, in the example, cancer. You also have exercise physiology, right? So this is basically where you're taking all of the functions and the structures of especially the skeletal muscles and the skeleton and the muscular system, and you're putting it all together in basically how our body works mechanically and physically, especially when we do exercise. And so exercise physiology isn't just about, how to tone muscle or, how to build muscle. Exercise physiology also crosses into all the physiology, like your metabolism, how your metabolism works, how your digestive system is working, how your body processes nutrients and utilizes nutrients, both in the process of exercise and also at rest. And so exercise physiology goes into all of that performance associated physiology that your body does, which involves multiple systems. Okay. Any questions up to this point? I've said a lot of words. Yes, Olivia is, yes. That's a good question, Olivia. I want everybody to know that. Olivia was wondering if we have access to these slides. They're posted on Canvas. So these slides you will have on Canvas. I also have chapter 4 posted on Canvas as well. And you'll also have the recording of the lecture posted on Canvas once it processes and becomes available. So thank you for the question, Olivia. Okay. So some of the major organs of the body, of course, the brain, spinal cord, that's the nervous system. Your lungs, part of the respiratory system. Your heart is probably the quintessential organ of the body, because the heart is the one that defines whether we're alive or not, right? We determine whether somebody is alive or not by whether or not they have a heartbeat. Liver, gallbladder, pancreas, large intestines, spleen, stomach, small intestines, those are part of the digestive system. Your kidneys are part of your excretory system, and your ureter is also part of your excretory system. So you have kind of like a lot of major organs, but you can bundle them together within the major systems. And we'll take a look at that here in just a second. So the first thing we want to take a look at is essentially kind of the organization of the human body. Because one of the big themes in human biology in particular is how structure and function are related, right? So the idea being that you have a particular function in the body, what kind of structure do you need in order to fulfill that function? Alternatively, you can also look at it as you have a particular structure, what functions will that allow you to do? And so structure and function are kind of inherently related. And that is oftentimes based on your function, you will get a specific type of structure. And so when you're building your organ systems, it's because you need a structure in order to pull off some sort of a function. And that's how you develop and organize your body into organ systems, right? Which is essentially a group of organs that tend to sort of focus on a particular job. And then when you take a bunch of organ systems and you put them together, you basically get an organism, and that's us, right? We're essentially a collection of organ systems. And we're all trying to sort of do the same thing, which is essentially keep us alive and functioning and able to, operate biologically in the world. And so we need a lot of structure and organization. And that's a theme that we see throughout AMP. Anatomy and Physiology 1 tends to focus a lot on structure as you're learning anatomy. And then, of course, in AMP 2, you learn both structure, but you also really dive deep into the functional aspects of that structure. So why does a structure look like this? It's because we need it to look like that in order to do this function. Okay. So let's just kind of do a very quick rundown of the organ systems. So the first thing we're going to see is our integumentary system, which is our skin. We don't have time in the semester to cover that one, so I'm going to move quickly over this one, but this is typically composed of your skin, hair, nails, sweat glands, and so forth. Very important system, but oftentimes it is the one that's left out, especially if we're in a pinch. And so in this semester, oftentimes we don't have time to cover the integumentary system. So we'll move on to the skeletal system, which we're going to be working on quite a bit in lab starting next week. And so the skeletal system is important because, first of all, its primary role is to provide protection. So you're protecting things like, for instance, your skull will protect your brain, and also support. For instance, the femur and the tibia and the fibula are there to basically support your body weight so that you can stand upright and you can walk. There's also other associated functions, which we'll unpack a little bit more in detail when we get to the bone physiology chapter. The muscular system typically is associated with a couple of things. First of all, it's associated with movement. So this is your ambulation. It's also associated with posture. So it allows you to be able to stay upright. Your muscles, your postural muscles are the ones that are basically allowing you to stand vertical all the time. And of course, they are the main generators of body heat. So one of the main ways that you maintain core body temperature is by contraction of your muscles. And so they generate a lot of the heat in your body itself. The nervous system is an integration system. And so its job is largely associated with control and regulation and detection. And so that's a lot of what it does. So basically it will sense the outside world, and it will regulate the response to that outside world, and it will control how your body responds to the outside world. So it's a coordination system. It coordinates all of the movements and the things that are happening in your body itself. Another coordination system is the endocrine system. So this is more of a chemical coordination system. And so its job is not so much movement and ambulation like the nervous system does, but its job is to regulate internal, typically visceral types of activities. For instance, your metabolism is regulated by your endocrine system. So is your growth, your reproduction, and a lot of other things that we typically don't think about that are typically internally regulated and kind of on autopilot, if you will, and kind of being regulated and controlled in the background. And so that's kind of what the endocrine system does. So it is kind of like the quiet controller of your body and of the activities internally of your body. Then we have the cardiovascular system, which is probably the most critical of all the systems. And one of the reasons is because its job essentially is to deliver. It's a delivery system. But what is it delivering? Well, the first thing it's delivering is gases that your tissues need to survive. It also is transporting nutrients that your tissues need to survive. And so it does a lot. So if your cells don't eat and if they don't consume oxygen, then they'll die. So basically, your blood is delivering the necessary components to your cells in order to keep them alive. The lymphatic system is one that we oftentimes don't talk a whole lot about in AMP2, but this is another circulatory system, an open system, and its job is essentially to take different types of things out of the blood, so it kind of cleans the blood and the lymph. It's part of your immune system. Actually, it will be a freeway for your white blood cells, and importantly, it will be the main regulator of your tissue, water, the water in your tissues. So what keeps your tissues from swelling up with water is your lymph system. It's like a sponge. It'll mop up excess water from your tissues, and then it will allow you to kind of maintain good body water balance. Okay. Respiratory system. So this is basically your acquisition, especially of oxygen, and your elimination of carbon dioxide. That's pretty much what it does. And as a result, it's the main, how should we say, the supplier of the most critical gas that we need, which is oxygen. If we don't have oxygen, obviously we die. It is also involved in pH regulation. Digestive system basically is associated with digestion, absorption, and elimination of nutrients. And so that's kind of the digestive system in a nutshell. Excretory system, or the urinary system, essentially is going to be looking at the elimination of waste products. That's basically what it does. However, it does a few things other than that. It'll actually control blood pH, and it'll also control water balance. So it actually does a little bit more than just get rid of waste. Urinary system is actually a really important system. Then we have our reproductive systems, right? So we have the female reproductive system, whose job it is to produce oocytes. Those are the female eggs. Her reproductive system is also capable of producing milk so you can feed the newborn, and of course producing hormones to essentially regulate sexual function, both sex drive and the different cycles of sexual performance and sexual activities as well. And then the male reproductive system is sort of similar, only in this case, the male system is not making eggs, it's making sperm cells. And also it will regulate the male sexual functions and behaviors as well. And so that's basically the systems run down lightning fast. So any questions up to this point? Let me check the chat here. Okay, real quick question associated with attendance. One of you guys is on iPhone 20. Let me guess, is that you, Sierra, with a C? We'll find out. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and move on to a really important topic in AMP, and that's homeostasis. Right? So we mentioned before that you have to maintain internal conditions, relatively constant internal conditions, and that's what homeostasis is essentially the maintenance of these internal conditions. Now, generally speaking, most variables, most things in your body are under homeostatic control. Most things, for instance, that you can measure in your blood are under homeostatic control. Hormones are in homeostatic control, calcium's under homeostatic control, sodium's under homeostatic control. So just about anything that you can measure is under homeostatic control. So exactly what is it and why do we need it? Well, here's basically what it is. So what we have here is body temp. I want to use an example of blood pressure because blood pressure is basically constantly oscillating throughout the day. So it's going up and down and up and down and up and down. Now, generally speaking, the way homeostasis works is as your blood pressure starts to go up during the day, as it gets to the peak, what happens is there's physiological responses that will turn on, that will turn that blood pressure back down. Then as it troughs, there's another set of physiological responses that will turn that curve back up. And then you kind of turn them back down and you kind of turn it back up and you sort of have this oscillation back and forth. And essentially you're oscillating between this range, which we call the homeostatic norm. And so your blood pressure does that all the time. Now, the reason why you do this is because physiologically, what you're actually doing physiologically is you're basically doing a bunch of chemical reactions of sorts. And here's the problem. Your body, when it wants to do a chemical reaction, it has to have some sort of an expectation. That is to say, the environment that it has to do work in has to be somewhat stable, because otherwise it's not going to be able to do its chemical reaction if there's a lot of instability in what's happening. Okay, think of it this way. I always like to sort of use the comparison of like, say for instance, somebody who maybe has maybe some sort of a kind of a mental health struggle, where emotionally very they're very volatile, right? So like one moment they'll just be like, just ready to pull your eyes out. I mean, they're just like rah, right? And then the next moment they'll just be sweet as anything. And it just like is a wild oscillation back and forth. You can imagine living with somebody like that would be difficult because you would never know what to expect from day to day. And so you wouldn't know how to conduct yourself. Matter of fact, if you talk to different people who are trying to work with individuals like this, they're kind of in this sort of almost functional slash dysfunctional paralysis, because it's like they don't know what to do. They don't know what they can and can't do. They don't know how to behave or what to do because they're not sure what they're going to get. They're not going to sure if they're going to get the sweet version or if they're going to get the really volatile version. And so it's difficult to basically function in that environment. And so oftentimes, like a person like that, they might take some medication designed to maybe, kind of take the top off those peaks so they're not quite so, volatile, and then kind of take the bottom out from the troughs so that they're not, falling into such a deep pit. So there's a bit more of kind of like an even keel, something a bit more constant and a little bit more predictable, so that this individual and the individuals around them can kind of know how to expect things and know how to function. And that's very similar to how homeostasis is. The idea is you keep it within a homeostatic normal so that you have some sort of a constant expectation so that you can actually get work and function done. So the example they use is body temperature, which is perfect, right? Because our body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees C. And so generally speaking, when your core body temperature starts to go up, it doesn't have to go very much. Your hypothalamus will sense it and it'll basically turn on some mechanisms that will start to shed that heat and it'll start to bring that temperature back down. And then once your body temperature starts to go below 98.6 degrees, there's another set of responses from your hypothalamus that will basically turn that core body temperature back up. And so it's oscillating constantly around this overall range of 98.6. And so that's kind of your homeostatic bullseye, and you oscillate back and forth around that. Okay. Any questions on homeostasis before we dig into feedback loops? If you're feeling good so far, give me a thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, let's talk about feedback loops. So these are basically regulatory loops. It's a regulatory strategy because once you have homeostasis, you have to regulate homeostasis. And then what that means is you need these loops. Now, here's how it works. Generally speaking, in regulation, you need a couple of different pieces, right? So number one is you need some sort of a sensory system. So you need a receptor. And so the receptors are out there to basically pick up stimuli in your outside world. Like a good example would be if your hand is on a stove, you need to have sensors in your hand that are capable of picking up that sensation of abnormal heat sensors. And then once you have those, then you have to send that sensory information, the intelligence, if you will, to a control center or an integrator. I like to think of it as an interpreter or an integrator. And in this case, the integrator is our brain. So all of the sensory information from your hand that this is hot is being sent through your nervous system up to your brain, which is your integrator. It's your control center. And then it receives this input from the receptor. And then what it does is it determines some sort of a response. And then it'll send that response out to the effector. And so the response will then go to, say, for instance, the effector, which is, in this case, the muscles in my arm. So my brain says, listen, it's hot, you're going to burn your hand. So those muscles need to contract and pull your hand off the stove. And so this is pretty typical for any kind of regulation. Matter of fact, this happens not just externally. The example I just gave you was more of an external type of an example. But this happens also internally. So all of the different situations and the variables that are changing inside your body, the things you don't even know about, are all having to be sensed and monitored by these sensory structures. And that information is being relayed back to the brain, which then decides what to do about it. And then it sends out the response to the appropriate effectors, whether it's a gland or a muscle or so forth. So Daniel, yes. So you said that an organism is always in a state of constant feedback, sort of oscillating back and forth, and that is absolutely true. So we are not a dead static system. We're kind of a dynamic system that's kind of like sort of bobbing and weaving homeostatically all the time. And then there's moments where we will breach homeostatic norm, and then we have to bring ourselves back down. Okay, and so that's kind of what feedback loops do. And so you're right, we are not a static system, we are a dynamic system. Physiology is very dynamic. So let's take a look at a negative feedback loop. This is basically one of the ways you can control your response and stimulus. Remember, you need the same things. You need a receptor, you need a control center, and you need an effector, right, that receives the response. Now, in this particular case, what we're essentially going to be using is sort of your thermostat, right? And so ultimately, what happens is a negative feedback loop will essentially bring things back to homeostatic norm once it gets out of the norm. So generally speaking, for instance, with the thermostat, if it starts to get too hot, that's your stimulus. There's generally a receptor that will sense the temperature, and it'll say, okay, the temperature is too hot, hotter than it's supposed to be set at, right? So we set the thermostat at a particular temperature. And then from that information, it sends it to a control center in the thermostat. And then that control center will process that information and come up with the correct response, which is, if the temperature is over this, then do this, right? It's kind of like a basic program. And so the then do this is the message that gets sent to the effector, which is the air conditioner. And that turns the air conditioner on, and then it starts blowing cool air into the house, and that brings the external environment, that is to say the house temperature, back down to where it was set at. Now, generally speaking, what happens is in order to turn this off, we all know that the air conditioner doesn't just run forever, right? As soon as it gets down to its set point, it turns off. And so that turn off mechanism is a negative feedback loop. So what happens is once it reaches set point, it feeds back to the control center to turn off. So in the control center, not only does it have directions to say, if it gets over this, then do this, it also has another shut off control that says, once it gets to this, your set point, then do this, which in this case is turn off. And that's kind of a negative feedback. Let's take a look at it with respect to our body. So first of all, we have kind of a thermostat in our body. We want to start off, first of all, we're playing tennis apparently here. So what we want to start off with is a hot day. Let's say it's, one of those hot days, it's like 97, 98 degrees. And so it's going to be a hot day. And so we're getting really hot. Our core body temperature is going up. So what happens is we have these receptors, these sensors in our skin that's going to detect the increase in temperature. So that's the first piece, that's your receptor. Then what's going to happen is it's going to send this information to your control center, in this case, your hypothalamus, which is this region right underneath here, right just below the thalamus. And the hypothalamus is like your thermostat. And so that's the part of the brain that's basically going to process the information, and it's going to tell your body what to do if your core body temperature is fouled up. So then what happens after that is once it processes that information, then it's going to send that information to the effectors in your skin. In this case, those effectors are your sweat glands. And so nervously, it's going to stimulate the sweat glands to start producing sweat, which will then be deposited on the surface of your skin. And it has to go through blood vessels. And so the blood vessels, which are carrying hot blood because you're hot, will start to shed that heat in your sweat. So your sweat will pick up the heat associated with the blood vessels in your skin. And then as it's resting on your skin, when the cool breeze brushes over your skin, what's going to happen is it's going to evaporate off your skin like an evaporative cooler. And then all the heat is going to leave with the sweat, giving you the sensation of coolness. So what we feel as cool is actually the sensation of heat leaving our body. And that is basically going to allow our core body temperature to stay back to norm because we're shedding the heat from our body. Anybody who's ever worked out really hard and you come in, you kind of feel like your body is like radiating heat. Ever feel that experience? It's like you come in and you're flushed, you're all red, and you just kind of feel like you're just a heat radiator. That's because all that hot blood is moving toward the surface of your skin so that it can shed that heat off the surface of your skin. That's under control of your hypothalamus. So then what happens is once you actually get down to your set point, your core body temperature, then what happens is the negative feedback stops the response. And then you stop sweating because you no longer have to lose any more heat. And then you basically reset yourself. That's kind of what it looks like. So we start off first of all with our stimulus, right? Our receptors receive the sensation. They send that information to our control centers, our brain. Excuse me, I'm ahead of myself here. I jumped like about 2 steps ahead. First of all, let's start off with our homeostatic curve. So here's our homeostasis. There's our oscillation. That's normal, right? So this is the normal region right here. But when we get out of normal, we start to get above that homeostatic norm. That's when we start to disturb homeostasis. And that's when we start to trigger our feedback. So then at that point, we receive the information from our receptors. And that sends it to the control centers to say, hey, you're getting a little hot here, a little hotter than normal. This is not homeostatic. You've broken the homeostatic cycle. And then it's going to send these instructions to your sweat glands, which are in your skin. It's also going to send instructions to your blood vessels to dilate And that's the reason why we turn red and get flushed when we run, because our blood is moving up toward the surface of our skin. And then that's going to be shedding heat through our sweat and through our blood vessels. It's going to bring our body temperature back down, and it's going to essentially get us back down to our homeostatic norm. So our homeostasis is restored at this particular point. And then ultimately, what's going to happen is if we disturb homeostasis on the other side, when we sort of shut it all down, the opposite happens. So we decrease the stimulation once we reach our set point. We also decrease the inflammation if we get cold. This is kind of the cold response. And we sort of do the opposite. For instance, if we get cold down here, hypothermia, for instance, then we're going to basically tell the brain to shut down sweat, because we don't want to sweat off our heat. We want to save our heat. Oftentimes, our blood vessels will basically constrict, and ultimately, they will kind of maintain the core body temperature sort of closer to the core. The other big thing we'll also do is we'll stimulate the muscles to shiver. So whenever you get cold, this is the reason why you shake, because your skeletal muscles are the major heat generators in your body. And so when you start to shiver, that's your body trying to bring your core body temperature back up. And so they're generating a lot of heat, and you're maintaining that heat in your blood vessels. So you can kind of see in this case, you kind of have mechanisms for both sides. Okay. So that's kind of a negative feedback. And then we have kind of a positive feedback. Now, a positive feedback, so where negative feedback tries to bring you back to homeostasis, ultimately, positive feedback is where you try to knock yourself out of homeostasis. So it's a little bit different. And you may wonder, it's like, well, why would you want to do that? Well, I'll give you an example of that one here in just a second. Because I want to, once we cover both of them, I want to kind of give you an example biochemically of how each of them works that might be a little easier to understand, because the physiological ones are kind of a little more complex than the biochemistry ones, which are a little more straightforward, but the ideas are fairly much the same. So ultimately, what you want to do is you generally want to kind of create a stimulus that gets you beyond homeostasis. Now, here's the problem. In some textbooks and in Seeley, they oftentimes say that positive feedback is unusual as kind. I've had some books actually say they don't exist. That's not true. Because positive feedback actually has a really critical role to play. Now, on a physiological level, maybe they're not as common as at a biochemical level, but at a biochemical level, positive feedback loops happen all the time. And I want to explain to you why they're useful. But the main positive feedback loop that we see is during childbirth. And so the hormone oxytocin is the hormone that is released by your posterior pituitary, and its job is to stimulate the uterus to contract during labor. Well, one of the things that happens is once the uterine wall starts to contract, it actually sends a stimulus back to the pituitary to release more oxytocin, which then allows the uterus to contract, which then stimulates more oxytocin release. So you can see a self-reinforcing cycle. That's what a positive feedback loop is. And then ultimately, once the child is born, then it breaks that cycle. Lactation is also a similar sort of a feedback loop. So is blood clotting. It's also a feedback loop. And blood clotting is a really good example of why you have positive feedback loops. And this is the reason why I don't like this phrase here. I don't think this actual phrase right here is accurate. Because the problem is, in a normal, healthy individual, childbirth will occur normally in healthy individuals. in a normal healthy individual, lactation will occur in a normal healthy individual, like for when a woman is having a baby. In all individuals and all people, whether they are man or woman, normal healthy individuals will also have blood clotting. Not only that, but if they don't have blood clotting, they will not be normal nor healthy. They will be dead. So really, this is not true. What will cause death is if you don't have them. So that first bullet is really actually not accurate, because your blood clotting is a life and death situation. And if you don't have positive feedback for your blood clotting, you will bleed to death and you will die. And you will probably have bled to death long before you made it to this class, if you didn't have blood clotting. So ultimately, there are harmful positive feedbacks. Times when your self-reinforcing cycle spins out of control, right? So in those situations, for instance, hemorrhaging is a good example. So when you're hemorrhaging, your blood pressure drops, your heart basically goes through this positive feedback loop to try to restate blood pressure. But the problem is if you still have the hole in your femoral, all you're going to be doing is not restoring blood pressure, but you're just basically going to be pushing the blood out and hemorrhaging even stronger. The more you hemorrhage, the more you try to fix it. The more you try to fix it, the more you hemorrhage. It's a self-reinforcing loop, which is the reason why hemorrhages are very dangerous and you bleed out very quickly, especially if you happen to injure one of the major arteries like the femoral artery or any point of your aorta. So generally speaking, oftentimes when you have positive feedback, these effectors will tend to go above and beyond. So here's kind of what it looks like. Here's the childbirth version. So here you can see with the uterine stretch, it stimulates sensory nerves that will then tell the pituitary to produce oxytocin, which will come to the uterine lining. And then it'll cause that uterine muscle to contract. And then the contraction, which will create even more uterine stretch, so you can see extra pluses here, will continue to send that stimulus back to the pituitary, which will send even more oxytocin, which will then increase uterine stretch. And then the contractions will continue until the baby comes out. And once the baby comes out, there's no more uterine stretching. So after birth, there's no more uterine stretch. Why? Because the baby's out. And you kind of have this sort of deflation effect, sort of an anti-stretch, if you will, recoil. And so since you have no more uterine stretch, then there's no more stimulus. And then, of course, you move from there into the lactation response, where the stimulus of the sucking mechanism of the baby on the nipple sends a sensory information to self-reinforce the milk delivery. So the process of actually the baby sucking will actually stimulate, positively reinforce the mammary glands to produce more milk. So it's a positive feedback. Okay, so here's the thing I want to do. I want to basically couch these because a lot of times students will kind of scratch their heads a little bit when they're talking about homeostasis and we're talking about feedback, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to them, because the physiological feedbacks tend to be a little bit on the convoluted side, because there's a lot of things going on physiologically. There's a lot of regulation. There's a lot of systems happening. There's a lot of variables happening. What I want to do is I want to break it down to more of a biochemical type of a strategy. So the principles are still the same. So basically, with a negative feedback situation, biochemically, this is basically when a product, any kind of a product, inhibits its own production. So in an example, let's use, say, for instance, molecule A goes through a reaction to become molecule B, which then goes through a reaction to become molecule C, and then it finally becomes the final product, D. So it's basically a multi-step pathway to your final product, which is whatever D is. And then we have enzymes that govern these reactions, little enzymes A, B, and C. So ultimately what happens is when D, that's your final product, increases in concentration in a negative feedback loop, which happens is ultimately D will start to come back and it'll shut down its own production, oftentimes by essentially shutting down the activity of that very first enzyme. So what this does is it's basically a way for you to essentially turn off a response, and then you allow yourself to come back to homeostasis. In a positive feedback loop, let's say we have the same pathway. This is essentially where a little bit of product stimulates or reinforces its own production. So here's an example. Let me use the same ones, right? So we have A going to B, going to C, going to D. Here's our enzymes, boom, boom, boom. Now in this case, let's imagine that we just have a little bit, just a little bit of D, just a little trickle. But what happens is that little bit of D will come back, and what it'll do is it'll have a positive, like an upregulation of its production. So that little bit of D will go back, upregulates production, so you basically turn on the big engines and you start mass producing D. Now, why is this important? And why is that first statement not accurate? Because the reason why you have positive feedback is because typically speaking, whenever you take a look at whatever this product D is, right? Let's imagine that D is a molecule that's necessary for survival. And here you have time on this graph, and here you have the concentration of D. Now imagine that generally speaking, at very low levels, like the little trickle level, D will basically just be made in a very, very slow fashion. Very slow, just gentle creep, just a little trickle at a time, and it'll take like forever to get up to high concentrations, right? Let's say that's normal without positive feedback. What positive feedback does, and let's imagine that what happens is like right about at this particular time right here, you need to have this much D. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to die. Well, here's the problem. If all you're doing is making a little trickle of D, then you're going to be dead long before you ever get there. You're never going to make enough D in order to survive. So what positive feedback does is it basically D will feed back and sort of turn on the big engines. It'll upregulate its own production so that as a little bit comes in, it starts to reinforce its production, and that starts to reinforce its production, and that starts to reinforce its production until what you end up getting is more of an exponential increase of D in a short period of time so that you can live. We have a lot of mechanisms like that, where we have to make a ton of a particular molecule very quickly. They're actually scattered all throughout physiology. And so now, once you actually get this really high amount of D, you don't need it all the time. Once you survive, it's time to sort of ramp it back down. That's where your negative feedback comes into play. Your negative feedback will then feed back on it and start to shut down its production. And then down comes your concentration of D until you come back down to normal homeostatic levels. So on one side, you have a negative feedback scenario, and on the other side, you have a positive. This basically is what allows you to be able to have very quick responses so that you can respond quickly and physiologically to catastrophic events like hemorrhage, for instance, or like blood clotting. If your blood clotting didn't have positive feedback, you would never be able to blood clot in time to keep yourself from bleeding out. And we see many, many, many such responses throughout physiology where some sort of a molecule has to be made in large quantities very quickly in order to survive. So in reality, with that, can we just basically X out this entire bullet? Why? Because it's wrong. Okay, any questions on feedback loops? Are they making a little bit of sense? Everybody okay? Good. So now let's take a look a little bit at some terminology. And so this is an important place to start in AMP1 because we got to get our terms straight. And so the first thing we want to start off with is your body plan. Okay, so like what are the parts of your body, the positions of your body, and so forth. The first place we need to start is with what's called anatomical position. So anatomical position is essentially where your body is erect, your face is forward, feet are together, and the palms are facing out. That's anatomical position. So your thumbs are pointing toward the side, away from your body. That's anatomical position. And then from that position, then we can start to sort of use that as a foundation to start laying down different types of positional terms. They tend to come in pairs. The first one we want to cover is going to be the concept of supine versus prone. So a supine position is basically when you're laying on your back with your face upward. That's the supine position. The prone position is with your face laying downward on your stomach. The reason why that's important is because when you're doing imaging, oftentimes you need to have different body positions in order to capture the correct image. Now, in terms of direction, we want to try to get this kind of straight early and often. All right, so directionally, we have a couple of different directions. Superior basically means above. For us, it's similar to cephalic, right? So for instance, with quadrupeds like the cat, instead of superior, they have cephalic or headward. Inferior, which is below, right? So for instance, superior would be above, inferior, or caudal, tailwise is below. So a cat, instead of inferior, would have caudal. This is important because when we start to get into cat dissections, the cat terminology will not have superior and inferior. It'll have cephalic and caudal. And so, for instance, our belly button is inferior to our nose, right? So it's further down than our nose. The other big piece, another big one that we have is our aspect, right? So we have lateral aspect versus the medial aspect. So the medial aspect is typically associated with what is straight right down your midline. So if you drew a line right down yourself right here, that would be your midline. Things that are medial are actually toward your midline. Things that are lateral are actually toward or away from your midline. So for instance, your thumb right here in anatomical position would be referred to as lateral to the pinky, which is more medial because the pinky is closer to the midline. So for instance, blood vessels that are right here on the inside of the arm are more medial than blood vessels that are out here on the outside of the arm, which are more lateral. Now, the other set of terms which oftentimes confuses students is the proximal distal designation. Proximal just basically means near, distal means far. And it's typically near or far from a reference point. Generally speaking, the reference point is usually your midline, right? So for instance, or the core of your body. So if you were to take a look at your hand is more distal than your elbow because your elbow is in closer to your midline than your hand. Okay. So distal structures are far away from something. Proximal structures are closer to something. So you would say that the proximal structure would be the elbow. The distal structure would be the hand. Okay. Then we have layering. So superficial versus deep. So superficial is on the surface of the body. Deep layers are layers that are deeper underneath. So if you take a look at the top layer, that's superficial. The bottom layer is the deep layer. So that's kind of what it looks like also. So we have a couple of other directional terms. So when we kind of turn our body around, we also have anterior, posterior. So just to orient ourselves. So here is our superior aspect. This is our inferior aspect. Our posterior is associated with our back. So you can think of it as dorsal. So in a lot of quadrupeds, posterior is the same as dorsal. Think the dorsal fin of a shark. It's on the back. And anterior is the ventral side. So the anterior is going to be your stomach side or the ventral side, the belly side. And so those are a couple of major things. Those will change if you have a quadruped. So since we're bipeds, there's a specific aspect to it. If you go into vet tech, it's a little bit different. You have to kind of switch it up a little bit. You tend to use ventral dorsal with quadrupeds as opposed to anterior posterior. So this is basically a list of the directional terms, a table that will help you kind of orient yourselves. So you have right, left, superior, inferior, cephalic, caudal, anterior, posterior, ventral, dorsal, proximal, distal, lateral, medial, superficial, and deep. Notice how they come in twos. That's a very common sort of a thing. And so what we will do next time is we'll start going through the regions, the body regions, probably finish up this chapter and dive into chapter 4. But this is a good place to start for the next time because it's going to move into another topical shift where we start to move now toward the different regions and the names of the different regions of the body itself. Okay. Any questions? Okay, if you guys are feeling good, we are at our witching hour for the evening. So we'll go ahead and close down shop, and then I will see you guys on Tuesday, where we'll pick up where we left off and we'll get ourselves ready to start the skeletal section of our lab activities.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, take it easy.
I do have a really off-topic question.
Go ahead.
For like labs, exams and lecture exams, do you
Yep.
offer any earlier than like our night class if we wanted to pop in and do it?
Like if you wanted to do it during the day, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, let me before I want to I want to think about it before I say something I can't take back. Probably.
Okay.
Because usually probably what will happen is the content for the exam will probably finish up the prior Thursday.
Okay.
And chances are I will have a chance to either write the exam Friday or Monday. Possibly the exam might be written Tuesday afternoon
Okay.
at the latest.
Okay.
But if you were here on Tuesday afternoon, you went to take the exam. The lab exam, probably no, because I don't have access to the lab exam. But the lecture exam I could probably do.
Okay.
Lab exam's a little trickier because there's a lot of setup involved in it.
Yeah, I was just curious because my grandpa isn't doing good and I have a trip already planned in October on the 15th, of course. So I'm trying to figure out when to move my flights due to the exam.
I see.
So, and I can message you about it too, but I was just kind of curious if that was even an option.
You know what? As we get a little bit closer, because we've got a few weeks before the 15th. So as we get a little bit closer, let's kind of talk and try to get a more kind of a specific strategy. Because as we get a little closer, I think things will kind of clear up a little bit more, and we'll have a better idea of like, I think I might be able to set up the lab exam earlier so that you can get out.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Have a good night. Thank you again.
You too.
I also have another question in regards to lab, if that's okay.
Yep.
So I also sent you an email, but on top of that, I'm a little concerned just with my work schedule and distance to the the lab to be there in person, just because I have to get home to go online for the Zoom class on Tuesdays. And I remember you said on Tuesday that it runs until 9:20, so if I'm late, that's okay. I just
lab-
wanted to confirm.
Yeah, the lab runs from 6:30 to 9:20.
So if
So,
I'm
like-
late, that won't affect my attendance score or anything.
So like if you're like for the lecture, it sounds like the lecture is the bigger problem really than the lab.
Yeah,
So-
I think the lecture is what's making it trickier for me to get to lab.
So for the lecture, you'll be counted as present if you're in person or on Zoom.
Yes.
Either one.
And as for lab,
Yes.
how do you look at attendance then?
So I will count you as here if you are here for either lecture or lab.
So I missed lab on Tuesday, because I literally just couldn't get there.
Yeah.
But I did do the lecture. So what would my score look like? Because last year I was in biology and I took your lab, and then I took a separate lecture class by a different
Yeah.
professor.
Mhm.
And it seemed like they were separate entities.
Well, they
So-
were.